Welcome to our third and final lecture of week 5. We will continue with our discussion of the progressive era and the various reforms that went along with that in the early part of the 20th century. We looked at the progressive era a little bit in yesterday's lecture. We'll continue today and probably wrap things up on Monday with the progressive era before we move on to American foreign policy during this time period. So today's lecture will focus primarily on labor reform and the changing role of the presidency with regard to big business and corporations and labor. It will probably be a shorter lecture than our normal lecture. We'll close out the week with a shorter discussion today before wrapping things up on Monday and moving on to the next unit. So, without further ado, let's dive right into it. I want to begin by discussing labor reform today, and particularly the activism and reform movements that centered around protecting the health and welfare of women workers and child laborers. That was a big thing during the first decade of the 20th century, the early 1900s, right as the progressive era was really beginning to take off. And I want to start by discussing Florence Kelley. We mentioned Florence Kelley in yesterday's lecture as she lived for a while at the Hull House, the settlement house that Jane Addams founded and operated in Chicago. Florence Kelley lived there and worked alongside Jane Addams. They were activists together, particularly with regard to women's labor issues. But Kelley herself had a major role in the reform movement for women workers in the early 20th century. She was an activist who sought to improve working conditions for women. And again, it bears repeating. I know I've mentioned this before in our discussions of labor unions in the late 1800s, as well as some of our discussion in yesterday's lecture as we kicked off our look at the progressive era. But there really isn't a whole lot. There really aren't a whole lot of standards and laws and regulations for labor during this time. That was something that unions tried to bring about through striking or threatening to strike, but it was something that largely the large corporations in America were of this time period were unregulated and could sort of do as they pleased until certain things happened, such as with the muckrakers we discussed yesterday, exposing some of the dangerous and unsanitary working conditions that, say, Upton Sinclair exposed in his 1906 novel The Jungle, which led to government regulation of the food processing industry and ultimately led to both the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and subsequently the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which is still around today to provide government regulation of the food industry. Well, Florence Kelley was the head of an organization called the National Consumers League in the early 20th century. And in this role, she inspected factories and really pushed for new laws, new legislation that would improve the workplace for women. She advocated a shorter workday for women laborers, and she really pushed for these reforms at the local level and at the state level, trying to get state legislatures and governors and state governments to create new legislation that would protect women laborers. State governments did begin to implement laws that provided limits on, say, the amount of time that women could work in a single day. Again, before all of these reform efforts, there was no standard 8-hour workday or 40-hour work week. Companies could have employees work as long as they asked them to, with threatening job security as the carrot to get all laborers, as women and children, but especially men as well, for working crazy hours. And we discussed that again when we looked at the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, the two labor unions that emerged in the 1870s and 1880s last week. And we talked about how those two organizations wanted a shorter workday because for factory workers, male factory workers during this time were being worked to extreme conditions, oftentimes working 6 days a week for perhaps as much as 58 to 60 hours per work week, which is a tremendous amount of work, especially when you consider the standard 40-hour work week that we have in place in America today across most industries. So what Florence Kelley wanted to do was get a shorter workday for women laborers, do that through state government and state laws. That worked, and of course that resulted in some challenges from companies and corporations that wanted to continue to be unregulated, and in terms of how they set their hours for their employees, including their women employees. In 1908, there was a Supreme Court decision in the case of Muller versus Oregon, in which the court upheld a 10-hour workday for women. So from 1908 forward, women were restricted to 10-hour workdays and could not be forced to work 12, 14, 16 hours or more in a single day, as in some cases they had been prior to that Supreme Court decision. Beyond the actual limiting of the workday and shorter hours, labor reformers such as Kelley and others wanted better working conditions for women employees, a safer workplace. Factories in the early 20th century were not always safe places to be. They were excruciatingly hot, and a lot of employees were working in small spaces, and the buildings oftentimes were overcrowded to the point, where there were fire code violations and things of that nature. What would be fire code violations in today's work? There really wasn't building codes and fire codes at this time. And so what happened is you would occasionally see a major tragedy occur in the workplace that would open up the eyes of the media, as well as rank and file citizens in major cities, and oftentimes it would generate national headlines and be eye-opening across the country. And the most prominent example of this occurred in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a company that produced clothing in a factory setting in New York City. It employed hundreds of women, mostly young women who were mostly immigrants and mostly of Jewish and Italian ancestry. And in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City caught fire. The owners of the factory had locked the doors to the rooms in which their employees were working, sort of barring them from the hallway because they did not want their employees to take unauthorized breaks during the work day. And as a result, the women simply couldn't get out of their confined space where they were working as the building went up in flames. And that left women with an unbelievably horrific choice. As the flames engulfed the building, women had the option of either staying put and being burned alive or finding the nearest window and jumping out to the street below, where they would almost certainly die as well. At the end of the fire, the building was destroyed. 146 employees, all of them women, had died in the fire, and an additional 71 employees sustained injuries in this tragedy. What made things worse was the fact that the employees of this company, all of these young women, had attempted to strike for better working conditions and higher wages, as well as union representation, a year before the fire happened. And the management and ownership of the company resisted, and the local police broke up the strike attempt a year earlier, and now, a year later, after the fact, after the strike failed, I should say, there was this unspeakable tragedy that cost so many lives, but it also was the event that served as the catalyst to spur reform, as stricter building codes and factory inspection regulations were implemented in New York City and in other urban areas around the country. But it took an event so dramatic and so tragic as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in order for these new regulations to be established and put into place. And it was obviously of small consolation to the family and loved ones of the women who died or were injured in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. But that's a major event in the Progressive Era, a major event in the labor reform movement of the Progressive Era, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 that destroyed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. If you look at the photo in the upper left-hand corner of the slide here, it gives you a couple of images there. On the left is the building as it was burning down from the exterior, an exterior look at the building as the firefighters are trying to get the blaze under control. And on the right is the carnage inside the building, including burned bodies after the fire had been put out. That was what it looked like on the inside after the fact there. So pretty striking images there that sort of underscore just exactly how horrific this event was. But it's, as I said, a major turning point in labor reform, particularly with regard to women's labor in the Progressive Era. I mentioned some of the muckrakers in yesterday's lecture, particularly Ida Tarbell, and who went after Standard Oil Company through that 19-part magazine series in McClure's magazine, as well as Upton Sinclair, exposing the meatpacking industry in Chicago and the unsanitary conditions in that factory, in that industry, in the novel The Jungle. And I also, if you recall, I mentioned Jacob Riis, who published a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives, which was an expose of the slums of New York City that were overcrowded and populated primarily with young immigrant families who were living in just unimaginable, abject poverty. It featured both a written description from Riis as well as plenty of photos that exposed the conditions, and it led to some building code reforms and some housing reform in New York City. There was another photojournalist muckraker of this era, similar to Jacob Riis, a man named Lewis Hine, who did a lot of muckraking work in a great deal of muckraking work, I should say, in the period around 1910, in 1908 through the early years of the 1910s. He primarily exposed dangerous and unsafe working conditions in which children were working during this time. There was a lot of child labor in addition to women's labor. Again, there was no laws that required kids to go to school until they were age 16, like there exists in America today. And so many children were working, whether that was working agricultural jobs if they lived in rural America or working in factories and plants in urban America. And Lewis Hine, in particular, exposed child labor and the exploitation of children in the South, primarily in factories in cotton mills from 1908 through the early 1910s. And that led to some regulation and reforms with regard to child labor as gradually that was eliminated as the 1910s and the 1920s came about. So Lewis Hine, like Jacob Riis, and similar to Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair, were muckrakers. There were plenty of other muckrakers besides those four, but again, muckrakers were these journalists, writers, photojournalists that through their work were able to expose tremendous inequality, tremendous exploitation, and a very unsafe and unsanitary workplaces that Americans of the lower class were working in during this time. Men, women, children, young and old, immigrants, etc. That's what they were working in this time, and the muckrakers really sort of brought that to the forefront. They were nicknamed the muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt because they, sifted through the muck of society, if you will, and got their hands dirty, figuratively speaking, to expose these conditions. So, speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, I want to move on and discuss his work toward reform, and particularly with regard to big business and corporations. A major part of his domestic policies and achievements in America as president. Teddy Roosevelt was added to the Republican presidential ticket in 1900 as William McKinley, who had defeated William Jennings Bryan in that election of 1896. McKinley was running for re-election in 1900 as the Republican incumbent. Teddy Roosevelt was added to the ticket as McKinley's running mate, his vice presidential nominee. McKinley won re-election and Roosevelt became vice president. However, less than a year into McKinley's second term in 1901, he was assassinated, and as a result, Roosevelt ascends to the presidency and becomes President of the United States. He would later go on to win a full 4-year term in the election of 1904. So all told, he served as President of the United States from 1901 through 1909. Teddy Roosevelt, simply put, transformed the presidency. He possessed a dynamic personality and was willing to use that to his advantage through speeches, public speaking. He was an excellent speaker and a captivating speaker, and had very strong convictions. And he realized in the 1900s that the president had a unique advantage over any other government official in America at that time, and that was the ability to give public speeches and get those speeches publicized in newspapers and in media. Yes, we sort of take that for granted with the presidency today, as anytime the president speaks, whether it's in a press briefing or in a speech, there's throngs of media on hand to record it and show excerpts of it on the evening news and quote the president at length in the newspaper. Well, in the first decade of the 20th century, this was sort of a new phenomenon that a president would speak regularly in order to advance his agenda, I should say, through the media, through using the media as a conduit to reach the people and gather support for his policy agendas and move it forward. That was sort of a new thing that Roosevelt did that most of his immediate predecessors, McKinley and Grover Cleveland before him, Benjamin Harrison before Cleveland, those folks did not do that. They spoke publicly from time to time, but they didn't do it regularly, and they didn't do it as a means to persuade the general public through their words and their rhetoric. That was something that Roosevelt brought to the table when he became president. And in one of his more famous speeches on Labor Day in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt was giving an address at the New York State Fair in Syracuse, in which he stated that each man deserved a square deal from the federal government. He used the phrase square deal, and what that meant was he explained that the square deal would consist of protecting workers and consumers from big business through federal regulation. Now, it's important to note that Roosevelt was not anti-business, but he believed that the rank and file workers, the factory workers, the ordinary Americans needed to be able to bring home a living wage, work in relatively safe conditions, and not be abused and exploited by their employers. And he felt that it was the role of the federal government to regulate business and corporations, and if necessary, step in to ensure that these ordinary Americans were able to get their square deal, their piece of the pie, if you will. And Roosevelt put his words into action actually before he gave that Labor Day speech in 1903, because in 1902 he argued that the Northern Securities Company, which was a holding company that consisted of two of the larger railroads in America, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, Roosevelt argued that that was a monopoly and that it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And it's important to note here that holding companies such as Northern Securities Company were specifically designed as a method of circumnavigating, of getting around getting around the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, because they could claim that it was just a holding company that investors had an ownership stake in, but it wasn't a corporation per se, and they used that as the legal leg, if you will, to stand on against accusations of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Well, Roosevelt's decision to accuse the company of being a monopoly and have the Justice Department take it to federal court was viewed as a direct strike against big business, as the company's investors included some of the wealthiest Americans at the time, such as J.P. Morgan, one of the robber barons that we discussed a few weeks ago. He had ownership stakes in the Northern Securities Company, as did other very wealthy Americans during this time period. In 1904, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of United States versus Northern Securities Company that Northern Securities was indeed a monopoly, and the court ordered the company to dissolve into separate companies that would compete against each other, and thus give workers a bit more leverage in terms of landing a job as well as negotiating wages and a contract for themselves. Another example in which Roosevelt used the power of the federal government to spur regulation of big business occurred in 1902. There was a coal strike, an anthracite strike that began in the late spring of 1902, in May of 1902. Approximately 150,000 members of the United Mine Workers left their jobs and went on strike in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. These laborers wanted many of the same things that previous factory workers and laborers had sought in the 1880s and 1890s: the right to unionize, a wage increase, and shorter work days. And in particular, they wanted a wage increase of 20%, and they wanted their work days reduced from 10 hours to 9 hours. The mine operators balked at these requests, and the strike continued throughout the summer and into the fall. And by the middle of the fall, Roosevelt began to get very concerned. He believed that if the strike didn't get resolved and the workers didn't go back on the job, that there would be a coal shortage in America right as the winter was approaching, and it would directly affect consumers across the country who would he thought would blame the government. And since he was the president and the Republican president, he thought the Republican Party might get hurt in the midterm congressional elections. So Roosevelt, in October of 1902, summoned the mine operators and the representatives from the UMW to Washington, D.C. in order to negotiate a compromise and end this strike. The operators refused to negotiate with the UMW representatives, so Roosevelt threatened to send in the U.S. Army to work the mines. This was probably would have been illegal, but the operators of the mines were frankly scared of that Roosevelt would do this and what might result from that. And so in order to prevent that from happening, the operators agreed to have an arbitration commission that would be appointed by Roosevelt, examine the issue, and ultimately settle the strike through their decision. The commission met and ultimately came up with a compromise. They denied workers the right for unionizing, so they couldn't become a federal union. They did approve a wage increase, but it was a 10% wage increase instead of the 20% that the laborers had sought from the beginning. And they did agree on the shorter workday, going with reducing the workday from 10 hours to 9 hours. So the workers wound up getting the shorter workday, and they did get a wage increase, except they only got about half of what they sought in increased wages, and they did not get the right to unionize. But in the wake of the strike, Congress established Congress established a new department, the Department of Commerce and Labor, in order to regulate big business and corporations, and it also passed the Elkins Act in 1903 to provide additional regulation of corporations, particularly sort of eliminating the ability for corporations to give preferred rates, sort of under the table, wink, wink, nod, nod, handshake agreements with preferred vendors and business partners, as opposed to having it more open and available for fair negotiations. So it's important when you take a look at Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal and his intervention into the relationship between corporations and their employees in these instances. That was something that was a departure from the presidents of the 1880s and 1890s. William McKinley didn't do that in his first term as president. Neither did Grover Cleveland. In fact, as we discussed with the Pullman strike last week, when that strike occurred and the governor of Illinois refused to assist the Pullman company in ending the strike, Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to end the strike forcibly. Roosevelt didn't do that. In fact, Roosevelt wanted to come up with a solution that was a compromise for both the businesses and as well as the rank and file factory workers, the ordinary factory workers. And so this was a new era of regulation and of stepping in if big business got too much of an advantage over their employees. It's an era known as trust busting. Roosevelt gets a lot of credit for his trust busting. Trusts were basically large corporations that had been consolidated, where companies such as Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, for example, through vertical and horizontal integration, which we talked about a few weeks ago when we discussed the robber barons in great detail, where they build up their companies into these giant corporations, these behemoths of industry, and dominate entire industries. And the resulting company that was bigger, having absorbed competition from smaller companies within those industries, that was known as a trust. And so Roosevelt, with his actions on the Northern Securities Company example, basically took legal action that resulted in that trust being busted. And that was something that Roosevelt would do throughout his presidency, and it was also something that his successor, William Howard Taft, would continue from 1909 through 1913 as well. So this is a time period where these dominant corporations that had ruled the industries of the manufacturing industries in America in the 1880s, 1890s, and at the dawn of the 20th century, now all of a sudden they are not necessarily being attacked, but they are being regulated for the first time. And in some cases, if Roosevelt or the Justice Department thought they were too big, the legality of those corporations was being challenged in the court system. So that will wrap up our discussion today on labor reform and business and corporation reform within the progressive era. We will pick up with some political reform and financial reform in our lecture on Monday as we continue to look at the progressive era that spanned the 1890s through the 1920s in America.